The smell of fresh paint and sawdust was the scent James knew as home. At 50, his body carried the map of a life dedicated to hard labor on the construction sites of Cleveland, Ohio. His hands, thick and calloused, could lift steel beams, but trembled slightly when trying to dial his children's numbers, just to hear their voices. Since his divorce nearly a decade ago, silence had become his most faithful companion. A cold companion, echoing in every room of the house he had built himself, but could never manage to fill alone. The nights were the hardest, when the only company was the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of memories of a love that had rusted over time. He had resigned himself to loneliness, treating it like a war scar, a mark of survival. His children, now adults with their own lives, insisted he get out there, meet someone. "Dad, you still have a lot of life ahead of you," his eldest son Michael would say during their Sunday calls. James would just smile, a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. He believed that the time for love, for vulnerability had passed. His heart was an abandoned construction site, with the foundations of an old feeling still visible, but without the energy to start a new building, until Sarah appeared. She was the manager of a small coffee shop near one of his work sites. James went in one day to escape a torrential downpour, ordering just a black coffee, no sugar. He sat at a corner table, watching the raindrops run down the window when she approached. "A tough day?" she asked, with a soft voice that seemed to warm the room. She was 45, with brown eyes that held a hint of melancholy and a smile that seemed to fight against that same sadness. They didn't talk much that day, but the seed of curiosity was planted. He returned the next day, and the one after that. The conversations started shyly about the weather, about the coffee, about the city's baseball team. Gradually, James found himself sharing stories about his projects, about the pride he felt watching a building rise from nothing. Sarah, in turn, spoke of her life with a vulnerability that disarmed him. She told him she had moved to Cleveland to start over, fleeing a painful past that she painted in vague but moving strokes. She made him feel seen, heard. For the first time in years, someone didn't look at his calloused hands with strangeness, but with admiration. "These hands have built things," she said once, touching them gently across the table. "They tell a story." The relationship blossomed like a wild rose in concrete. In a few months, Sarah was no longer just the woman from the coffee shop. She was the laughter that filled the silence of his house on weekends, the aroma of lasagna that greeted him after an exhausting day. She moved into his house naturally, almost imperceptibly. Her things, few and carefully chosen, mixed with his. A vase of flowers on the kitchen window, a romance novel on the nightstand, a pair of colorful shoes next to his work boots. She turned the house into a home. James felt like a man who, after crossing a desert, had found an oasis. He let his guard down completely. He gave her not only the key to his house, but the password to his trust, his hope. He was finally building, not a building for others, but a sanctuary for himself, and Sarah was the architect of his new happiness. Little did he know that the foundations of that sanctuary were being laid on a ground of lies, about to collapse and bury everything he had learned to love. The next 3 months were the most serene of James's life. The routine that was once monotonous gained color and sound. Waking up was no longer a solitary effort, but a soft duet. The 5 a.m. alarm was silenced by Sarah, who was already up, the smell of brewed coffee spreading through the house. "Good morning, my builder," she would whisper, and the kiss she gave him tasted of a new beginning. He would leave for work with a tired body, but a light heart, carrying the lunchbox she prepared with a care that bordered on devotion. On the construction sites, under the hot sun or the cold rain, James felt invincible. He was no longer just putting up walls. He was building a future, a refuge to return to at the end of the day. The evenings were filled with conversations on the living room sofa, her legs over his, as they watched old movies or simply listened to the sound of the crickets outside. Sarah was an extraordinary listener. James opened up about his fears, about the difficulty of connecting with his children, about the dream of one day buying a small boat and fishing on Lake Erie in his retirement. Sarah not only listened, but encouraged. "We'll buy that boat, James. I'll paint the name on it myself," she would say, her eyes shining with a sincerity so crystalline that any doubt dissolved before it could even form. He included her in his plans, in his finances. He gave her a supplementary credit card for emergencies and to take care of the house, he said. She resisted at first with a humility that moved him even more. "You don't have to, my love. I don't want to be a burden." But he insisted. He wanted her to feel secure, to know that this home was as much hers as it was his. The crack appeared on a grey Tuesday in October. The day began like any other. The coffee, the kiss, the promise of a special dinner. "I'm going to make that roast chicken you love," she said, adjusting the collar of his jacket before he left. At work, James felt strangely anxious, a restlessness in the pit of his stomach that he attributed to the damp weather heralding the arrival of winter. He counted the hours until he could go home, to the warmth of Sarah's embrace and the smell of roast chicken. As he turned the corner of his street, however, he felt the first chill. The porch light, which she always left on, was off. The house was plunged into a silent, foreboding darkness. He went inside, and the silence that greeted him was the old, heavy kind he knew so well. "Sarah," he called, his voice echoing in the emptiness. No answer. The kitchen was spotless, cold. There was no sign of the promised dinner. James's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He ran up the stairs, calling her name. The bedroom was tidy, the bed perfectly made. But the closet? He opened the door, and his breath caught. Her side was empty. The colorful clothes, the shoes, everything was gone. Only the empty hangers swayed slightly, like skeletons of an extinct happiness. On her pillow, a single folded piece of paper. James's hands were trembling so much he could barely open it. Her elegant handwriting said only, "James, I'm sorry. I need some time for myself. Don't look for me." There was no explanation. There was no reason, no fight, no warning. It was a period without a sentence. The pain that hit him was physical, a dull blow to the chest that left him breathless. He sat on the edge of the bed, the crumpled note in his hand, and looked at the empty space beside him. Her scent was still there, a phantom perfume that haunted him. The next few hours dragged on in a fog of confusion and denial. He called her cell phone dozens of times. Voicemail. He sent messages that were never answered. He called the coffee shop where they met. "She quit last week," an unfamiliar voice said. "Said she was moving." James's world fell apart. The architect of his happiness had demolished the building and disappeared with the rubble, leaving him alone in the dust. If this story has touched you so far, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the unfolding of this drama. The days turned into weeks of agony. James operated on autopilot. He went to work, ate without tasting, and slept a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of her smile. His children, Michael and Jessica, visited him, bringing food and concern in their eyes. "Dad, what happened? Did she say anything?" Michael would ask, but James had no answers. He felt ashamed for having believed, for having opened up, for having been so foolish. The house, which for a brief period had been a home, once again became just a structure of wood and bricks, colder and emptier than ever. He felt like an idiot, a pathetic old man who had fallen for a romance scam. And while he drowned in sorrow, the real scam, silent and digital, continued to bleed his savings, bill by bill. The Cleveland autumn stripped the trees, leaving bare branches that seemed to scratch the grey sky. It was a perfect reflection of James's soul. A month passed. 30 days in which every sound in the house made him turn his head in the hope of seeing her. The creak of a step, the sound of the wind at the window, everything was a phantom echo of Sarah. He began the painful process of erasing her presence. He packed away the few things she had left behind in a box: a book, a coffee mug, a photo of the two of them smiling in a park. Each object was a dagger that twisted the wound. He wanted to feel anger, but all he found was a deep void and a sadness that weighed on his shoulders like a concrete beam. At work, he became even quieter. His colleagues, rough men with good hearts, noticed the change. "Trouble in paradise, Jimmy?" one of them, Dave, asked during lunch. James just shrugged, unable to put the humiliation into words. How could he explain that the woman he so proudly showed off in photos on his phone had simply vanished? He buried himself in work, asking for overtime, exhausting his body to try to silence his mind. Physical fatigue was a welcome relief from emotional exhaustion. The house was just a place to shower and collapse into bed, which was better than facing it as the mausoleum of his hopes. One night, while trying to pay some bills online, something caught his attention. A credit card bill that he normally didn't use much was higher than expected. He frowned, opened the statement, and saw a few purchases he didn't recognize. Women's clothing stores, an expensive perfume. A knot formed in his stomach. They were purchases made the week Sarah disappeared. Could they be hers? Maybe she forgot to tell him. His mind, desperate for any non-malicious explanation, clung to that idea. "She'll call me and explain," he told himself, closing the laptop. He would pay the bill and wait. Hope, even if poisoned, was the last to die. The call came 2 weeks later from an unknown number. James was at the supermarket, pushing a cart with the same bland food as always, when his phone vibrated. "Hello?" he answered without much interest. "James, it's me." The voice, the soft voice that woke him in the mornings, now choked and hesitant. James's heart raced, a mixture of shock, relief and anger rising in his throat. He remained silent, not knowing what to say. "James, please, don't hang up," she begged, and he could hear her sniffling on the other end of the line. "I know I have no right to call you. What I did was horrible, unforgivable. I panicked." She began to weave a tragic and convincing story. She spoke of an old debt that had come back to haunt her, of a family emergency in another city, of dangerous people who had threatened her. Shame, she said, had prevented her from telling him. "I didn't want to involve you in my problems, James. You're such a good man. I don't deserve you." The words were both a balm and a poison. He wanted to hate her, but the part of him that still loved her wanted to believe. Then she got to the main point. "I have to confess something terrible," she said, her voice a whisper of guilt. I used your card. I was desperate. I spent about $3,000. I swear, James, I'll pay you back every penny. As soon as I get back on my feet, I'll pay you back. I'm so sorry, so sorry. $3,000. The number hung in the air. It was a lot of money, but in James's mind, it sounded more like an act of desperation than malice. Her explanation, though vague, filled the gaps that had been torturing him. It was better to have a tragic reason than none at all. "Where are you, Sarah?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I can't say. It's safer this way," she replied. "Just forgive me, please." And before he could say anything more, she hung up. James stood frozen in the middle of the canned goods aisle, the phone in his hand, his heart a turmoil of emotions. The pain of loss was now mixed with pity and a strange sense of relief. At least now he had a story, a narrative for the disaster. That night he told everything to his son, Michael, who came to visit. Michael, a young accountant with a skeptical and pragmatic gaze, listened to the whole story in silence, his expression hardening with every word. When James finished, perhaps expecting a bit of sympathy, Michael shook his head slowly. "Dad, that doesn't make sense. Her story is full of holes. Dangerous people, an old debt. That sounds like a movie script." James became defensive. "You don't know her, son. She was scared." Michael leaned forward. "I know you, and I know your heart is too big for your own good. $3,000? She calls crying, confesses a specific amount, and hangs up? That's weird. Dad, please let me see the full statements, not just this bill, everything." James hesitated, feeling like a traitor for doubting her, but his son's firm gaze made him give in. He just didn't imagine that Michael's investigation would reveal not an act of desperation, but the blueprint of a carefully planned demolition. James felt a chill run down his spine as he handed over the online banking passwords to Michael. There was a part of him that resisted, that felt dirty for prying into the privacy of a woman he had loved, even if she had abandoned him. It was the foolish loyalty of a good heart, refusing to believe the worst. "It must be just that, son. 3,000 and nothing more. She was desperate," James murmured, more to convince himself than Michael. The young man didn't reply, just opened his laptop on the kitchen table, his face serious and focused. The only sound in the room was the soft clicking of the keys and James's heavy breathing as he watched over his son's shoulder, feeling like a defendant awaiting a verdict. Michael was methodical. He opened statements, credit card bills, checking accounts, organizing everything into a spreadsheet. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The daily bills, grocery shopping, gas. James started to feel relieved. "See, I told you," he started to say, but Michael held up a hand, asking for silence. "Dad, the card she confessed to using, the purchases don't add up." He pointed to the screen. "She said she spent it on an emergency, but here are charges from luxury boutiques downtown, a spa, electronics stores. This isn't desperation. It's a shopping spree." The first wave of nausea hit James. The images he had of Sarah, humble and simple, began to distort. "But the amount, it's around 3,000, like she said," James pondered, his voice failing. Michael shook his head. "Yes, on this card. But you gave her a supplementary card from another account too, didn't you? The one you use for house expenses." James nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening. Michael navigated to another page, and that's when the floor opened up beneath James's feet. The screen filled with an endless list of transactions, online shopping on designer websites, plane tickets to another city, one way, multiple ATM withdrawals, always in small amounts to avoid drawing attention. There were dozens and dozens of small bleedings, made over weeks, starting long before she disappeared. Michael's spreadsheet calculated the total in real time in the corner of the screen. The number climbed dizzyingly with each new line he added. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000. James stopped breathing. He stared at that growing number in disbelief, feeling cold sweat run down his forehead. Each transaction was a small betrayal, a brick removed from the foundation of his trust. The memory of Sarah saying, "I don't want to be a burden," echoed in his mind, now sounding like a cruel joke, a mockery. Her laughter, her affection, the smell of coffee in the morning, it all became part of a macabre performance. She didn't love him. She studied him. She didn't build a home. She mapped out a safe. "Dad." Michael's voice was low, filled with a contained anger. "The total is $21,400. 21,000. The number exploded in James's mind. It was his savings, the money for the boat, the money for a peaceful retirement. Years of hard work, of aching backs and cracked hands, turned into designer clothes and plane tickets for a liar. Her phone call wasn't a confession, it was a damage control strategy. She threw out the bait of $3,000 so that he, in his blind compassion, would be content with that truth and not dig any deeper. She had manipulated him one last time, counting on the good heart that she herself was stabbing. A cold fury, unlike anything James had ever felt, replaced the shock. He stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard. The swing he had fixed for when his grandchildren came to visit creaked in the wind. Sarah had sat on that very swing, her head on his shoulder, talking about growing old together. The betrayal wasn't just financial. She had stolen his future. She had stolen his ability to trust, his peace of mind. She left him emotionally and financially bankrupt. The pain in his chest was no longer from longing, it was from violation. He hadn't been abandoned by a panicked lover. He had been plundered by a calculated predator. The man sitting at the table with his son was no longer a heartbroken lover. He was the victim of a crime. And the only thing left amidst the rubble of his life was the cold determination that she would not get away with the last laugh. The truth has been revealed in all its brutality. Do you approve of this part? If so, we will finish the story with the conclusion, showing how James deals with the consequences and finds a new kind of strength. That night, James's house, once a sanctuary of love and then an echo chamber of loneliness, transformed into a headquarters. Sadness gave way to a sharp clarity. For the first time, James didn't cry for Sarah. He cried in anger at himself for his naivety, but they were quick, hot tears that dried and left behind the ember of determination. With Michael by his side, he spent the night on the phone with credit card companies, reporting the fraud. And the next morning, he was at the police station, filing a report. The process was humiliating. Having to detail the intimacy of his life to a stranger, the way he was deceived, felt like rubbing salt in the wound. The police officer, with a weary look, was honest. Frauds like this were hard to track. Sarah had probably used false names and, with the money in hand, could be anywhere. There were no promises. The months that followed were a battle on two fronts, one bureaucratic and one emotional. The card companies managed to reverse some of the charges, but the cash withdrawals and certain purchases were irrecoverable losses. The remaining debt was still a mountain. James had to postpone his plans to slow down at work. At 50, when he should have been thinking about rest, he found himself working double shifts, taking every extra job that came his way. The physical exhaustion was brutal, but unlike before, there was now a purpose that drove him. Every dollar he earned was an act of defiance. It was him saying to Sarah's ghost, "You will not break me." The biggest change, however, was internal. The soft-hearted man, who fell for a smile and a sad story, gave way to a more cautious, wiser man. Sarah's betrayal, as devastating as it was, acted like a fire that burns a dead forest to make way for new growth. He reconnected with his children in a way he couldn't before. The vulnerability he showed them was not one of weakness, but of honesty. Michael and Jessica rallied around their father, offering not pity, but support and respect. They helped him organize his finances, spent Sundays at his house, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to be with him. James discovered that the true, unconditional love he had been searching for already existed in his life, just in a different form than he had idealized. He never heard from Sarah again. Sometimes, he would see a woman on the street with similar hair, and his heart would still give a painful leap, an involuntary bodily reaction to trauma. But the image of her in his mind faded. The smiling face was replaced by the lines of a bank statement. Love gave way to a bitter but valuable lesson. He learned that trust must be built slowly, like a building, beam by beam, and not handed over like a key. A year later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, James was not on a construction site. He was in his garage, sanding the hull of a small, old, battered fishing boat. He bought it for a fraction of what he had dreamed of, and the boat needed a lot of work. Beside him, Michael was applying a coat of sealant to the wood. It wasn't the dream boat he had planned with Sarah in the light of a romance. It was something much more real. It was a project, a promise he made to himself. As he worked, his hands again covered in dust. Not from cement, but from old dreams being renewed. James looked at his son, who smiled back. In that moment, he felt a peace that no overwhelming passion had ever given him. The bill for the betrayal had been high, but the final payment came in the form of self-knowledge and the rediscovery of the love that truly mattered. He was finally building something for himself, on foundations that no one could ever shake again. If James's journey of overcoming also moved you, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. We want to know where you're watching from, so comment with the name of your city. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories like this one, and explore the other videos on the channel for more impactful narratives. So you don't miss any stories like this one, and explore the other videos on the channel for more impactful narratives.